I've got an opener. If you don't, unless you do, if you've got like a burning one, I've got.
Oh, no,
Uh,
no, go for it. I have no place. No, I can find something, but I did not come prepared with a place to start.
okay, cool. Well, yeah, I don't feel like necessarily prepared to start or whatever, but I just have a question immediately that I just would like to throw up to the room. Sorry. I'd like to just kind of get people's and it's pretty early because today we read the second half of the preface reading, which is most of the B preface, right? We read most of the B preface and to the end of it. And at the start of this week's reading, I kind of immediately I was on a train and I wasn't thinking all that hard. And so I didn't, these are probably answerable, but I had some pretty immediate questions, because at least for me on the Geyer Wood edition it's on page 112, but the German pages it's BXX. So BXX is where things already started to get confusing for me. Because he's talking here about, or he's kind of following up this discussion that he had about uh, experience itself being a kind of cognition requiring understanding, the concepts of an a priori ground of nature, things of that sort. And on BXX, he starts getting into this stuff, the phrase, and in Geyer Wood, they bold certain words which I like because I'm not very quick on the uptake, so I like when the important words are bolded, like unconditioned. The word unconditioned being bolded there. I just wanted to know. So he says that it seemed to me that he's telling this sort of story of you know, speculative reason engaging in this sort of foray, seeking, or reason seeking what it can't have. The love that dare not speak its name, seeking the thing in itself, whatever that might be, the thing, or things. Shout out Things. That's a good movie called Things. Barry J. Gillis for the 6 people who watch this YouTube channel. Good movie. But so I just wanted to clarify. I wanted to ask, like when he says this, in fact, the whole, like, I don't know, but herein lies just the experiment, providing a checkup on the truth of the result of that first assessment of our rational cognition a priori, namely that such cognition reaches appearances only, leaving the thing in itself as something actual for itself but unrecognized by us. For that which necessarily drives us to go beyond the boundaries of experience and all appearances is the unconditioned, which reason necessarily with every right demands. So is he describing here basically like the cognitive move that created like the notion of an unmoved mover? That's what I thought of. Was like he's basically saying here that when you start trying to look into this realm, the supersensible or the unconditioned, like there's a natural urge in reason to find the truth, whatever that is, and it leads to this thing, the unconditioned. And to me, that made me think of like, and he says later, like right after that, basically speculative reason basically cannot advance into this super sensible without leading into contradiction and weirdness. And one of those things that it made me think of was like Aristotle's unmoved mover. You know what I mean? Like, is that, it seems, I just want to clarify, like, is that kind of what he's talking about here? Is that what he's saying basically? That when you start questioning the thing in itself or the thing beyond appearance, you immediately have a need for the unconditioned. And when you have a need for the unconditioned, you start postulating these things or whatever, like an unmoved mover. For is an example of an unconditioned, right? I think. And follow up to that before I just mute and cede the floor is that later um he talks about such forays into this realm of the supersensible and the possibility for convictions to arise in this realm. And I'm just talking specifically B32 in the German and B33. So that's XXXII and III, B30 and 32, or 32 and 33. He says that these have ever, after originating in the schools, have these ever, after originating in the schools, been able to reach the public or have the least influence over its convictions? And my thought is like, yeah, I thought so. He's saying that rhetorically. He's like, obviously not. Nobody cares about this stuff. but my thought was like I thought so, like unmoved mover and stuff. Like I thought those had like pretty profound effects on like the world. You know what I mean? And like everybody, like if ever, basically. So that's my question. Is he basically saying that we have like a natural, or when we start thinking ourselves into this sort of uncritical metaphysics that he disagrees with, we start getting into realms of like unmoved movers and stuff. And then also, is he saying that like that's like hogwash that doesn't have like an influence over the public? Because I figure they do. You know what I mean? I don't know. What do you guys think? Am I making sense?
Uh, yeah, made sense to me. So I think to give a short answer to your question, the answer is yes. That okay, so what I think he's talking about is basically the second half of this book is the dialectic part, where he's going to talk about uh reason when it goes beyond the conditions of possibility for a possible experience, all that stuff. Then he'll show these kind of antinomies and of pure reason, how it leads to contradictions when you don't have that limitation of condition for a possible experience. You don't have some kind of sensible intuition to correspond to the understanding. So I think that in his analysis of those antinomies, I'm not sure if I'm exactly using that word right, but I believe that unmoved mover is involved in one. I think the idea of like what is like causality and like world and how he talks about like how the idea like everything has a cause. If it goes back far enough, well then you can say, okay, that works, but then eventually it has to end somewhere, and then you don't have a cause. So you've got this kind of contradiction between the idea of causality taken to its limit, which is basically like an infinite regress of causes, and the idea that it has to start somewhere. So I don't know. I'm probably totally butchering that, and also probably butchering Aristotle. Not that like I'm really trying to give an explanation of it, but that's my best attempt.
I mean, I don't think that's wrong. I think that like Kant is responding to Hume, right? And in a lot of ways, he's also responding to the entire history of Western philosophy that they'd been exposed to up until that point. And this problem just creeps up no matter what side you end up on, like whether it's empiricism, rationalism, idealism, there's always this issue of having a foundation, an ultimate foundation. Heidegger calls it like an ultimate ground. And everyone tries to posit their own. Kant's going to try to do it through an epistemology. But Spinoza does it by saying, substances causa sui. It's the only thing that's self-causing. We'll put that at the bottom, then we'll build up from there. And I think he's just talking about this general tendency that if you don't put something at the bottom, then you have infinite regress, just endless, what caused that, what caused that, what caused that. And you can put a mysterious mover there. That's one way to do it. You can reject foundationalism entirely. I agree, Chase. You can reject foundationalism entirely, like Hegel or Nietzsche, maybe, depending on how we read Nietzsche. Or you can, provide like a different argument. But I think Kant's ultimately just trying to say that, like later, I think he tries to solve that problem, but I think he's just trying to point out the problem now that in order to provide a sufficient ground, we tend to overreach and posit things that are beyond all possible experience. And that's been up until this point in his view, an error in philosophy.
And I think reason is like the child who's always asking why, and you answer that question and they go, well, why? And then you answer that question, they're like, well, why? And so reason's kind of like that. So, when you're doing logic or, well, I guess in Kant's case, when you're doing syllogisms, you keep getting these broader and broader scopes, when you start moving up this syllogistic chain of reasoning, and reason just wants to keep going until it hits some absolute final thing that can explain the totality. And so it's just the way reason works. It just wants ultimate explanation. It wants the nature of reason is such that applying reason is always moving toward more and more general answers, categories, and so on. It's and given that Kant thinks that you really can't use reason. Well, I don't know. We're not talking about the critique of practical reason, but you can't use it except in the scope of experience. Reason just has this tendency to want to push past the bounds of experience, and Kant's like, can't really do that legitimately.
Can't do that with speculative reason,
Right,
or the speculative use of reason,
right.
which
That's
is
why
really
we're not talking about the critique of practical reason here.
right. Which that distinction is obviously a huge part of this whole book and his project and the preface, which was quite a preface. But yeah, I think is at least his kind of like general outline of what he's doing is pretty clear, I think. Uh, at least I thought so. In those terms of you got this speculative use of reason. Defining exactly what that is a little difficult, but you got the speculative use of reason that needs to be limited to possible experience. Is really like the basic idea of what he's getting at. Even though reason has this tendency to reach for the unconditioned, to go beyond all these conditions of possible experience that he wants to limit it to. And then he say a lot of this, the preface is saying, okay, this might worry people. Like, I'm limiting reason, but I'm only limiting this speculative use of it, theoretical use. You've got this practical, moral use that does all the cool stuff that, metaphysics is all about. That goes into the super sensible. There you get morality, freedom, God, the soul, immortality. You get all the cool stuff. I mean, some people might consider cool. Kant's cool. I'll give him that. So yeah, I think that's the basic idea of what is going on here, and with the whole preface is that basic move, and then also the whole distinction between the same thing as appearance or as thing in itself. That goes along very much with this whole what he wants to limit speculative reason to, which is appearances, objects as appearances. And then the whole first half of the book, the analytic part, is going into the detail of exactly like how that works. But yeah, that's I lost my train of thought, so I'm just gonna mute and shut up.
Okay, actually, I wanted to ask you, Chase, or I mean anybody. Keep in mind, please, I'm super new to this. I have 700 plus pages to find out exactly. I think I grasped this idea that he has, or the care about practical reason only here. But So, and according to him, we can reason only about what is structured by, like our form of intuition and these categories of understanding, which he starts mentioning here. But actually, in the parts that we read last time, he started to introduce these. This method of, he's trying to take the method from math and science, right? So he was saying the math, in order to be successful and function, in a way, had to be detached from this natural realm and follow rules that are imposed by the human mind, pretty much. So Kant want to try this with metaphysics. Let's try to apply this and maybe, or this method, and maybe we'll have more success and actually gaining some knowledge. But how much, I don't know. My doubt is a bit, is this fundamentally a different project then? Are we giving up on a lot of the questions, right? Free will, God, immortality, like these are these questions are more conceptual, abstract, right, speculative. So is Kant assuming that this metaphysical knowledge can be grounded in structure that only makes sense in this empirical reasoning?
So this has to do with that distinction. Chase and I were batting around between speculative and practical reasons. So when you're talking about the structure of experience, which is what this book is doing, the speculative use of reason cannot answer questions like, is there free will, is there a God, and so on. So he's trying to define the limits. He's trying, so his, like, well, you probably got that in this preface. One of his big issues is that he thinks philosophers have made claims that reason can answer questions without ever asking, well, what are the limits of reason itself? And so he's trying to figure out, like, I think Tristan Sosa once said in a class, it's like we're inside this cup of experience and he's trying to find the walls. It's like he's trying to find the limits. And you can't really step outside the limits of experience. And so you can't answer whether there is free will or not, whether there is a God or not, when you're using reason in this sort of speculative mode to probe the structure of experience. But when he gets to the critique of practical reason, which is another book, not quite as big, but another major tome, then he has some positive things to say about those. So he does come back and say, I mean, he never contradicts himself. He just, I don't know, my version of it, you guys somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, is since speculative reason can neither affirm nor deny that these things are true, like freedom and God and so on, we are permitted, for the purposes of making morality rational, we're permitted to believe that these things are true, but only in the domain of practical reason, which is the domain of ethics. So in the domain of ethics, we are permitted by speculative reason to assert that they're true, but it's not a dogmatic assertion. It's again, reason can't answer those questions, but if you want a rational morality, you have to make certain claims about those things, but they're not dogmatic claims. Like he says in this section, I thought it was interesting. He says, I am making dogmatic claims, but they're dogmatic in the sense that you can prove them deductively through the use of a priori. You can prove them using reason. And he never says you can do that about, like, freedom and in the existence of God. So in this book, he's concerned to show that you cannot prove either one way or the other using reason in this speculative mode. But then when you get to the critique of practical reason, where he's talking about ethics, he says, nevertheless, we are permitted to affirm certain claims about these things for the purposes of ethics. So he doesn't completely abandon them. He just postpones them until he gets to his ethics. Is that a fair rendering?
I generally would agree. Like, I think that, Kant is, like a lot of philosophers, is sort of concerned with this really big, deep picture, but then it's also like, you also have to brush your teeth at the end of the day and like buy groceries and interact in practical action throughout your daily life. And like Kant always wants to use a transcendental argument, just saying that like, what is the necessary, like underline that word, necessary condition for the possibility of this thing? And for Kant, at least, one of the necessary conditions for the possibility of morality is free will. It's not that like we're going to make a metaphysical argument to back free will. Like I personally don't like believe in free will. I'm a Spinozist, but Kant is concerned and worried that like what will you ground morality in if you take away free will? And so at least in the way that we understand now, it's a necessary condition for the possibility of any kind of robust ethics. And so it's not about whether or not it's metaphysically true beyond the mind, but just practical living. How do we do this without that? It seems to be necessary. While I might disagree with him for kind of small but large reasons, I think, especially at least back then, like he was basically right. And people could argue that he's definitely right now.
I was just going to throw in too, I'm agreeing with everything that's been said, but also for Kant, practical reason does enjoy a priority over speculative reason. So it's not the case like we try to do speculative reason and then we fail and then we fall back on practical reason. But I think he wants to elsewhere show that all of our speculative reason is subordinate to practical aims.
Although he does start with speculative reason.
Yeah, I mean this book is mainly about speculative reason. Uh, I think another thing that's quite interesting is how much this is distinction between appearances, phenomena, and the noumena, things in themselves. Those are slightly different, but that goes along with the same distinction between theoretical and practical, where practical is about the object as noumena, as something that can be thought as a presupposition for these givens of morality, which I think he took as Kant was, they were given to him and they were necessary. So therefore, I think it's perfectly rational. What he's saying basically that yeah, you need these presuppositions of, he goes on. He doesn't talk about for brevity's sake, he doesn't talk about the God or the immortality of the soul one, but he goes into a little of the freedom one, where I think he gives a pretty good demonstration of exactly what's going on with okay, you've got some object. It's got this twofold way of determining it, where you've got phenomena, appearance, you've got causality. That's determined by nature. That's what theoretical reason should be limited to. And then you've got practical reason, which has to do with the same object, but as thing in itself. That's where morality is going to come in. So it's kind of, okay, so when I was reading this, I was thinking I don't know how accurate this is. I don't know. Eric, feel free to correct me, but it reminded me of the basic kind of like Cartesian distinction with, okay, you've got res extensa, you've got material things, that's going to be for science. That's going to be natural science, nature. And then you've got things of the mind, of reason. That's going to, well, not reason, but reason, that's more complicated. But Descartes got this thing where, okay, we'll give science to the extended world of nature, but we need to have also some kind of separate sphere for the church, for morality, for freedom that isn't determined by some kind of like mechanical causality kind of thing, because that is problematic. Morality needs freedom, but natural science has this principle of causality where it seems like that just doesn't apply. So we've got a conflict there. Descartes tries to somewhat have this reconciliation by putting these two different boundaries. And I think Kant is doing something similar, but he's doing it in a more sophisticated way. I'm not sure, but I don't know if that is even a good comparison. But that's what it made me think of when I was reading it. So, yeah.
So I mean, he is trying to reconcile the Newtonian physics in the face of Hume's problematization of causation, right? Like, so he is concerned to uphold natural sciences, and at the same time, he loves Rousseau. So freedom. How can we make sense of this? I don't think if it, in terms of the Cartesian extends and cogitans, that maps more on Kant in terms of inner sense and outer sense. But even here, the objects of inner sense and the objects of outer sense, insofar as we experience them, are always going to be phenomena.
Yeah. And so he had that little note kind of at the end where he goes into that refutation of idealism, which he extends to Descartes, which I don't. So I remember when we when we read Being in Time, Heidegger, he has a section on this section by Kant, the refutation of idealism, that kind of went into that. And first of all, I can see now why Kant put that in the preface to clarify. Because when I read the part that's just in the book, I was extremely confused. It seemed like really obscure. But reading that note, it's pretty clear what he's saying. And which is exactly kind of what Eric was just talking about. How, okay, yeah, Descartes, maybe that distinction goes along this line of like an inner outer kind of thing, where Kant is definitely problematizing that by this idea of, well, his whole refutation of idealism, this idea that kind of like the inner and outer sort of correspond with each other through determination and time and all these things. But
And being in
yeah,
a world,
so
right here, yeah, when he's discussing in the preface what's going to come later, like, oh, I've added this section, the refutation of idealism. It roughly goes like this. And he'll give it more thorough treatment when we get to the section. Yeah, I forgot the point I was about to make.
yeah, well, it was clarifying the part that's actually in the preface, the note. I don't know exactly why he didn't just put it in the text itself, but because I mean that was somewhat confusing. I don't know if that's a logistical problem, but because okay, he talks about as the one possible supplement that he's added that's not just about, you know, how it's the presentation of his system is this refutation of idealism. Um, but then he kind of puts this clarification in a note in the preface, which seems kind of itself. I'm not sure exactly why he did that. Some kind of like printing error or something. I don't know. But the note in the preface seemed much clearer than what I read in the actual and is the actual refutation of idealism later in the book. So I can see why he put it there, as it is clarifying. But I think it's an important point to make. I think already, even though it's kind of these prefaces and even the introductions, they're much easier than I would say a good deal of the rest of the book. I think that knowing the preface though is kind of getting into like the really technical Kantian stuff, which is great fun. But I think here in the preface, he's just getting warmed up, and he's got almost like a little rhetorical style, kind of a little bit. He's got a few metaphors and whatnot. So it's good to get a kind of a taste through this note about the refutation of idealism, this clarification of it, where you get a sense of Kant's real technical style.
It's worth pointing out the refutation of idealism was primarily inserted because a lot of the first readers of the critique took him to not depart from Berkeley very much, right? Oh, this is just another Berkeley and idealism. And he's like, oh, wait, no, that's never what I meant, So let me prove the existence of the outside world without this hand-waving gesture. Who was that analytic who did that? Here's my hand.
So that G.E. Moore?
Yes, there we go, G.E. Moore. The hand-waving gesture. Yeah, so Kant shits on G.E. Moore before G.E. Moore ever got to breathe by doing it properly. And then, yeah, the point I was going to say earlier is rereading it earlier today. Yeah, this refutation of idealism puts a heavy premium on temporality, experience needing to be temporal and also in a world, right? So being in time, being in a world, and Heidegger's downstream from this dude right here.
Did you say Kant was wanting to create space between him and did you say Berkeley?
Yes.
Okay.
It's also worth noting because you were talking about footnotes, clarification, and like the body of the text. And at like this time, especially in Western philosophy, it really like coming out of, in a lot of ways, Spinoza. Like Kant's trying to introduce an entire system, which he's going to end up arguing is transcendentally ideal and empirically real, and we'll see that with space and time, which, in my opinion, is kind of like the bedrock for everything. But what's important though is that like in the body of the text, and this is one reason why I appreciate reading Kant over, say, like Hegel. Hegel's quite figurative. He'll say things like, the night preserves this, like the moon preserves the sun. And he'll say this in like a really like figurative way. Like Kant doesn't typically make those kinds of moves. He's more interested in just doing like the actual long division in the text, which is why things are so long. It's because he's trying to be as rigorous as possible, and those clarifying marks in the bottom are usually where he's actually being a bit more reductive, or he's trying to anticipate a misreading of what's happening above and try to steer you away from that. Like he's quite literal. He's very rarely super figurative. Like Heidegger's super figurative, Hegel's super figurative. He's not trying for poetry. He's just trying for long division, showing all of his work.
I will briefly. This is a little. I don't mean to go afield, but like sometimes, like when Hegel gets a little, poetic, so, like when he says, like that's something you might have been thinking of the night where all cows are black. That's I mean, it's a lot of it can be like references to things that if you were like an 1830s guy, you'd be like, oh, that old Yiddish joke that I've heard. Because I'm from Stuttgart, and you know what I mean. Like, I think there was a time and a place where it wasn't so. But at this point, yeah, it's tough. Absolutely, very figurative, absolutely, and that's something I've heard. I guess to kind of reroute. I heard a comparison. I think I've said it before, even that Hegel writes in a way that can be. It's kind of comparable to like almost like a theologian sort of writing, versus a scientifically oriented or intended text like Kant sort of that's the basic sort of the layman way to like Hegel writes like a theologian, Kant writes like a scientist, is the basic sort of dividing line. But Yeah, I agree. Just a lot of attempts of, and in fact, actually, Tori and I were in the car recently talking about that. That yeah, he retreads ground like in like very slightly different ways, kind of over and over. Like Kant is, I think in Kant's mind at least, it's a relatively straightforward and kind of modest like sort of stance he's taking. He just has to kind of clarify it and restate it sort of a million different ways because it's really different from what's been going on thus far. But at the same time, he just thinks it's like it's both and one at the same time. Like I think you said, Alex, it's like at one at the same time, kind of a radical break, but also just like what's been in front of you like the whole time. That's kind of I think at least the spirit with which he's trying to present this. You know, and he doesn't seem all that like bitter towards other. We read some Schopenhauer. He doesn't seem all that like resentful or antagonistic towards other thinkers that he might think of as dogmatic. He just finds them to have gone wrong in a way that is totally natural. It's understandable that they would go wrong this way. It's an impulse. It's a sure. It's at least he's sympathetic. You know what I mean? But so yeah. Pretty clear on that. I like that. I agree.
Yeah, and it further confuses it too. Like that clarity needs so much more length when we're like obviously we're dealing with like I assume most of us are dealing with translations into English, but we're still dealing with like common German language at that time. And so we're using like everyday language and then completely redefining them. Like Spinoza did it with just God, and people are still confused. And like Kant did it with like intuitions, concepts, judgments, like virtually every common term that refers to like mental faculty, he turns upside down, provides like a whole different use case for, and then proceeds from there. So yeah, it's
Since we're speaking of Kant's readability, I've been telling Nevitt for years, like I Kant writes like somebody who really wants to be understood. It's just what he wants to write about and the time he's writing makes it difficult for us a couple hundred years later. It's technical, it's a little archaic, the language, but everything about the way he writes impresses upon me that he wants to be understood. And here at the end of this preface, he kind of goes out of his way to say a lot of what I've done in the second edition is because I really want to I was misunderstood in the first edition. So and then he says and then there are these minds in Germany that are getting it. They're going to be even better at making it clear because that's, writing clearly is not really my forte, right? Which is, again, right, reading him say that and knowing that Hegel and others will be coming later, like, yeah, I appreciate it, dude. A little modesty.
Wait, Tori, Tori in the chat. You're saying you think that this is sort of a sort of like absolute limit on abstraction. I mean, I've got this night full of black cows to show you. But if we want to really get also, here's a question that was also raised by Hegel in a famous article. Who thinks abstractly? That's a question I think worth asking. Who thinks abstractly? Pshaw, sabe kaput, I say. But finally, you're really into like, as far as I know, right? You're really into like, uh, or at least you're very well versed in a more analytic tradition, right? So like, things that gets to me, I guess, that gets like pretty abstract, where you're talking about like symbols and stuff, where it's like, it starts to, in fact, Kant several times here, and I wanted to know if anybody had any sort of thinking about this, because Kant says over and over, like logic is just the science of um, the very form or contours of like thought itself. That's what logic is. Which like I think I've heard before as outside of this. I mean, I've only read Kant in like excerpts and his Stanford Encyclopedia, so I must have been somewhere else. It must have been somewhere else, but I've heard that before. And I mean, Hegel's got a whole book, The Science of Logic, that tries to attack that, but not go against that, but try to attack the problem, the question, try to expound in a very different way. But yeah, that to me is more. I mean, I feel like in fact, uh, Kant is trying to be like very, very much like this is another way that I've heard this phrased. What is it? A guy who I disagree with on a lot of stuff, Nick Land, was being interviewed one time when he was at like some random convention. I know, Chase is shaking his head. Like I know, I disagree with him on some stuff, but he was talking about he's really into Kant, and he was like, look, the basic insight is there's nothing outside the theater. You know, you're seated, and there is, and you're at the theater, and there's not, and then what's outside? What's past? It's nothing. There's, you know, there's no way for you to. Well, actually, there is something, and it's the thing. And he would say it's like the thing from like almost like the thing from the thing from John Carpenter's The Thing. It's this sort of thing that we can only understand as an amalgamation and bizarre sort of assemblage of things that we recognize, dogs and people and meat and viscera. It's just this sort of this attempt, you know, at getting outside the theater. And I at least found that sensible. I found that, you know, at least not you know, totally. I didn't think through it, but I found that made sense. That seems reasonable, right? That's the basic insight, right? At least as far as we've gotten so far in the preface that he's trying to because I think that actually this is another thing that I talked about earlier today was that the first 11 pages of this reading was giving the reader like some pointers on like, you know, ideas to stay connected, like internal experience and consciousness of self and time, and experience, like we were talking about, an empirical consciousness of my existence and consciousness of a relation to something outside myself. Those ideas, keep those connected, you know, going forward, that sort of thing. But then the last part of this preface was like more administrative, you know, it was more like just like here's some things I changed in the edition, in the second edition. In fact, I think he literally starts it on the second edition, like concerning this second edition. You know, he gets into like things like that, which I found less interesting. But there were some. It seemed like here in this preface, in this first 11, at least in the reading, the first 11 pages of this reading, he's trying to just impress upon you some key insights that are like sort of a guiding post, almost like it's almost like you're about to walk through a cavern and he's handing you a torch to keep your light, like to keep your way. He's handing you a guiding light. Just keep this in mind. Keep these sorts of, and so in my mind, I guess I don't know how abstract we're getting, really. You know, I guess that's what I was thinking about. It was just I was reacting to something in the chat. It was like that saying that it was getting really abstract, but I guess I didn't experience it as getting really abstract, even though I guess it is a discussion of pure reason. So I don't know.
I think you should just count yourself lucky. I'm pretty sure like 99% of the population of those who've ever read Kant, especially on the first go around, were like, this is abstract.
Right. But I mean, well, lucky, or maybe, or in fact, very deeply unlucky. Very, oh God, you know what I mean? Like, just really bad turn of events that had to culminate in this position I'm in, where, you know.
I mean, I think it actually is quite abstract. I mean, if you think about what he's, I mean, you know, this is looking ahead, you know, and people who've never read Kant before will not know what all this means. But when when you think about him trying to set up these a priori categories of the understanding and claiming that space and time are part of the way, you know, the mind structures phenomena. I mean, these are just, they are really, I mean, the whole Copernican shift thing and all that, I mean, it is very abstract, I think. You know, when you start saying, well, there's these a priori categories of the understanding that are structuring phenomena a priori, and then you have empirical intuition. I mean, if you've, you know, if you've never encountered that stuff, I mean, the first time I ever read Kant, you know, years ago, it just, you know, it was just flabbergasting. I mean, I think that those of us who don't think it's crazily abstract, it's because we've been, you know, thinking about it for a while. But I think the first time you run into this stuff, it's just, it is very, very abstract. And again, that whole Copernican shift, because, you know, I mean, I think our quote common sense way of thinking about things is that my cognition conforms to the way things are in the world, so my mind has to conform to the way the world is, because the world is the way it is. The world is the objectively existing domain. I have this subjective consciousness that has to somehow conform to that structure, or somehow has to take this objectively existing world and bring it into my subjective mind. That's, if any, to the degree that people think about this stuff, that's kind of the normal way of thinking. This whole shift to say, no, objects conform to the modes of cognition, I think is just radically unsettling. And again, I think the reason some of us don't find it that way is just because we've been thinking and talking about this for a long time. So when someone says, this is really abstract and hard to grasp, I mean, I have lots of sympathy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that it's hard to grasp. Absolutely. Like I want to be like, yeah, this is not, yeah, this is definitely. But I guess what I was thinking about was just that it introduces an interesting problem. You know what I mean? I guess because if we can agree that it is, I mean, yeah, the like you're saying, these categories of understanding and so on. You're right. There's a certain. I guess I'm thinking about how that introduces an interesting problem. Trying to not abstract, specifically not go beyond experience, not abstract away from or outside of and kind of get away from experience, but at the same time being obligated to kind of talk about these things that we could all kind of agree are not like obvious parts of experience. You know what I mean? Yeah.
That's why, I mean, one thing that this reading this time was helpful. And I don't know if the Geyer, I'm using the Pluhar, I don't know if the Geyer uses the same words, but the distinction between cognition and thinking. So, cognition has to do with our empirical modes of thinking, thinking about the world. But he says you can think about things that are not in experience, but that thinking does not give you knowledge. So I can think about things in themselves. Like, I mean, one of the things that confused me for so long is why would he call, I don't know if it's the noumena or just the domain of things in themselves, but he calls it the intelligible realm. And I'm like, what the hell? Why would he call it that when you can't know anything about it? But I think that's it. You can only think about it. You can think about it, but don't make the mistake of your thinking about it constituting knowledge. So I can think about a thing in itself as a limiting concept of that which would, can't even use the word exist, but that which is the boundary beyond which my experience cannot penetrate. I can think about that, but when I think about the thing in itself, I am not acquiring any kind of knowledge. So cognition gives me knowledge, but that knowledge is restricted to things I can experience. Whereas this at least in the Pluhar, what he calls thinking is not necessarily going to give you knowledge. Even though I can think about, I'm not even sure I can. I can't really think about a square circle, but there's lots of things never mind. I was going to say that there's lots of things I can think about of which I have no knowledge, but I'm going to spend the next half hour trying to think of examples. So I'm just going to shut up.
You can
He
you can
does
just
say
use
contradiction
chimera.
is the limit of thinking. Like basically, you can think whatever as long as you're not contradicting yourself. That's kind of like the only thing I think he says is the limit of thought. But
Right.
I think that's a really good point. That distinction of thinking and knowledge is which that's kind of abstract, But I mean, hey, it's of thinking itself is abstract, and as he says, I know he says that logic is necessarily abstract because it's purely formal. It has to do with the formal understanding. Where am I? I'm in my house, but I'm in the living room. This is I'm responding to Joseph's question. I'm in my living room because my parents are out of town, so I have to take care of the animals. And I figured my cat would be easier to deal with if I was here in the living room. You could be controlled. I could maybe do something with him. I don't know. I think he's sleeping now. I'm not sure. He's probably doing something terrible, actually. I can't see him. Yeah. That's a good non sequitur to end, right? Okay.
So, forgive me for being late. Side note, the new Superman movie, do not recommend. I didn't. I thought it was atrocious with the same conflict climax resolution ad infinitum for 2.5 hours. I did like the Lex Luthor. That's good. He was fun. It was nice to see a megalomaniac, actual like Lex that was, good, I guess. But yeah, Superman was quirky and zany human, kind of a Revis, but fell flat emotionally on every aspect. When it comes to because I was thinking like when we finish this preface, there's like a very, very strong emphasis on the fact that there is a epistemological limit to humans that he's kind of embracing in a positive way that reminded me very much of the Hegelian dialectic, or at least Hegel's approach to how when you epistemologically reach a limit, it's an indicator of a larger framework. So it seemed like, and I'm not mistaken, right? Like Hegel was prior to Kant from the German tradition. It was Hegel, Fichte, and then Kant.
No,
Or
it's actually backwards. It's Kant, Fichte, Hegel.
oh, it is. Okay. So Kant may have been like the original introduction to like using human epistemological limits as like pointing to a larger framework or structure. Because like I thought on page 36, and this is like the part I have highlighted, was that we obtain the same result whether we proceed from the minutest element all the way to the whole of pure reason, or proceed backward to each part when starting from the whole, for this whole is also given by itself through reason's final aim in the practical sphere, and the result is the same because any attempt to alter even the smallest part immediately gives rise to contradictions not merely in the system but in human reason in general. So it seems like because of these epistemological limits that he's saying we can kind of derive a structure or a logic or a pure reason from them. And this, I don't know, like I guess he was he the first to kind of introduce this, because that does seem like a different approach to metaphysics that would be rather radical from the German tradition.
Well,
Yeah,
I think
yeah. Go ahead.
Hume did somewhat too, but go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I think Hume's program is largely more negative, destructive, problematizing. It's a skepticism. It's a useful skepticism. And I think Kant takes it as a useful skepticism. But then Kant tries to do something a little bit more constructive, productive, at least in the, well, two senses. Again, upholding the claims of Newtonian physics to describe a lawfully ordered nature, right? Which is not possible with where Hume leaves us. So Kant has a positive program there, and then he also wants to make room for freedom, right? Yeah, but going back, there is a negative element to Kant too. I think Joseph and Nevitt both touching on this. I think Heidegger makes the point that it's here that finitude, as such, takes central role in metaphysics. So prior to Kant, I mean, you guys were referencing Spinoza earlier, right? Spinoza talks about viewing the world and philosophizing sub specie aeternitatis, right? And Kant is taking that completely off the table. We have to start with our finitude. We're irremediably stuck in this finitude. And so just to add to that, if the thing in itself is it's a difficult kind of concept to wrap your hand around as you're reading Kant. Think of it as him giving a label to the old goal of metaphysics. Up to this point, we have been trying to know how things are in themselves from the aspect of eternity, what they really, really are, apart from any human subjective conditions. Well, fuck that. You can't get outside your human subjective conditions, so let's try it the other way. Let's start resolutely in our finitude in our subjective conditions and see how far we can go in actually securing objectivity on the strength of subjectivity.
Yeah, because it seems like he's laying the groundwork, like when he goes into speculative metaphysics, as to how this is not given by God or discoverable like in nature. It's not dogmatic. Like he's basically, my reading is like he's saying in a way that this is not a rigid axiomatic system. This is a critique to find a structure, and that you can't escape metaphysics, just like Heidegger was kind of making the same argument when you're like thrown into the world or thrust into the world, like how we have. It was kind of strange when he described time, because in my understanding, it was almost like he was saying time was like some type of spatial temporal lens that is just part of the human structure itself. So like this critique of pure reason in and of itself not being dogmatic opens itself up to a lot more, I guess, validity, which is a little bit scary when you're always approaching things from like a Neoplatonic or Platonic tradition of like discovering the principles or the structures that are God given, which is so interesting to me, because like from I went to a very religious college, and they were all about Neoplatonism and the scholastic traditions, and like Kant was borderline anathema in our philosophy classes. Like you couldn't mention him without it being like, no, that's just modernity, or that's something that is very, very just almost an insult. So it's like it is interesting to me how like he is deriving a structure from the limits of human cognition rather than like axiomatic dogma, which is pretty radical, right, for a philosopher of this time.
It's worth noting that some people might get angry at me for this, and take it with a grain of salt. Kant's not really a metaphysician, nor is he really doing metaphysics. Kant's really signaling the turn to and towards epistemology, and saying, like, Heidegger's critique is right in saying that the entire history of metaphysics has been to provide a framework of intelligibility. That's been the job of metaphysics. And every metaphysic sort of like overflows and then gives rise to like the new framework, and the cycle continues. Kant is aware of this, and he, in responding to Hume, who basically says, because there's no way to prove beyond like to an absolute certainty that like what I see or measure or whatever is real and accurate to what I see and measure. I can only make these disconnected sort of pattern recognition-y sort of attempts at like knowledge, which aren't actually certain. And so we can't have certain knowledge. And so like Kant's really turning away from metaphysics because Kant doesn't think the metaphysics ever can provide that actual ground. He thinks that epistemology is the only thing that can provide that ground to have good reasons for the certainty of even just like one thing or two things. From there, you can build out everything else. And so he takes on a radically different project, and he does it through transcendental critique, which is just always asking the question, if we have something that's like irreducible, we can't get deeper than that, in terms of it as a phenomenal experience. Like, let's say, like this is here right now, right? Like I can't find a simpler, more reduced way to like do that. Then necessarily there has to be these structures of cognition, like space and time, there, for in order for me to make that statement. So it's not like Kant's not going to metaphysically say, therefore space and time are real independent of the mind. Doesn't really care. It's more so that like, in order for me to say that this is here, I have to have inbuilt in the structure of my cognition these intuitions of space and time already there so that I can make those kinds of statements. And he's just going to make that move with essentially the entirety of cognition, or mind. And so it's really a turn towards epistemology, because he's talking about what structures must necessarily be there transcendentally, but not metaphysically. He'll really never make that claim.
It depends on what you mean by metaphysics, though, because if you through this whole section, he's using that word metaphysics. And so if, the traditionally, prior to, let's say, Hume, metaphysics was supposed to be what is the ontological structure of the world? Like Eric was saying, what is the structure of the world absent human cognition? Like, what is the world as it is in itself? So if you remove, if you could somehow have a God's eye view, like this, this eternal perspective of the world, absent any processing by human subjectivity, what would be the world? What would be the structure of the world? Well, that's what metaphysics was supposed to tell you. The way I think about what Kant's doing is he's saying, okay, you can't get there. After Descartes and Hume, you just can't get there. And so the best you can do, and I think of him as redefining metaphysics, the best you can do is explain the way that the a priori structures of consciousness generate this sort of the structure of the world for us, and that's the closest you can get. Because I'm thinking, like in the grounding for the metaphysics of morals, he talks about the metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals, and the metaphysics of nature is exactly the a priori structures that the mind uses to structure our experience of the world. And so I think of him as and again, it depends on what you mean by metaphysics. I mean, absolutely, you can't get at the world unprocessed by cognition, but what you can get at, which Hume missed, I think Kant would say, you can get at these a priori structures that give form and structure to experience. And that's the closest you can get to metaphysics. That's the way I think about it. So
I mean,
it
I
depends on
totally
what you
agree.
mean by metaphysics.
Yeah, I totally agree. So just to put my cards on the table, I'm sticking with that historical definition of metaphysics. Whereas like what you just gave is like if we're suggesting that Kant redefines metaphysics, and Heidegger is going to come out of that tradition where ontology is inherently phenomenological. It can only be done through a phenomenological lens, and we can view Kant in this lens too. Then metaphysics does take on a new character. I tend to just separate the two for, I guess, my own shorthanded understanding, but I think we largely agree.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to you, I mean, Chase was sitting in on this class. I had a class on 19th century philosophy, and one of the other faculty members in the department came and sat in on the class. I don't know if you remember Chase, but Marquez sat in, and because he was evaluating me, and he didn't say anything. He was just like giving me these kind of grumpy looks in his face. And so when he gave the evaluation to the department of the chair, one of his complaints was Kant doesn't do metaphysics, because I had been talking about, Kant's metaphysics and the a priori and all this, and Marquez is like, Kant doesn't do metaphysics. There is no metaphysics in Kant. And so, I mean, so to be fair, a lot of people would agree with, so to some degree, it's a terminological debate.
I do remember that very well and thinking it was hilarious. I think I constantly think about that when I'm reading Kant and the whole idea of like, okay, a sort of like straightforward sort of denial in the way that Marquez was doing. I think about that as like a reference point a lot of times when I'm reading this, thinking like, well, I don't. But as a con okay, so basically Heidegger, I read a little bit of his book on Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the Kant and the Problems of Metaphysics. And uh, first of all, Heidegger would disagree with Marquez, I believe, because his reading of Kant is that he's trying to provide a ground for or an outline of the science of metaphysics, which is also at the same time a fundamental ontology. So, um, he's trying to do metaphysics in his own way. He's trying to definitely give it the kind of reformulation that corresponds with the whole kind of way that he's trying to limit this speculative use of reason, and then give it but yeah, I think that what you're saying about this whole kind of like synthetic a priori structure of cognition, that's going to be essentially his outline for a complete system of metaphysics, which Eric was saying last time that he did provide this kind of like analytic scientific like filling in of this system. So I think it's fair to say that Kant did provide something like a metaphysics. But yeah, of course, I mean, to repeat basically what y'all were just talking about, yeah, it depends exactly how we're going to define that. But yeah, the okay, one thing though, I guess now we're on the topic that with Heidegger's idea. So he says I I follow him on what he's saying about Kant as doing this outline for the science of metaphysics. Kant directly says this. It's pretty clear. Um, but then to say I can't remember. I'm probably not doing much. I'm doing a disservice to Heidegger because I can't remember exactly what he says. But basically connects this idea of metaphysics with a fundamental ontology. Basically, what is the being of beings? That I don't see in Kant's text. So I'm not saying Heidegger's wrong necessarily, but I'm not convinced yet. I'm kind of confused exactly where ontology kind of like fits into this. And I think hopefully part of it is I need to read the rest of the book, but I will be paying attention to this question of ontology because it seems like I mean just like on first glance, kind of looking over this, it seems like Kant wants to avoid ontology as a kind of, that's kind of like a scholastic sort of thing to do. It's like Duns Scotus like, did ontology. Like that's subtle schoolman stuff. I don't know. At least that's the vibe I get from Kant. Is he wants to do something a little different than at least that. Well, of course, he doesn't want to do the traditional sort of metaphysics exactly, but I think along with that is there's this kind of confusing space of ontology going on here where if he uses the word being at all, it's kind of like a throwaway word that he just like puts in there, and that's kind of it. So, yeah, I don't know.
He explicitly takes up the concept of being as a kind of empty concept later on. He's again, it's not a hostility towards ontology. I think of it as prior to any break between epistemology and ontology as such, he is already kind of anticipating this by holding out an indirect ontology to be achieved through more of a emphasis on mode of knowing, the way we know.
Yeah, substance is one of the categories of the understanding, right? And substance was supposed to be what? I mean, the old substance ontology, substance was what accounts for the substantial independent being of things. But for Kant, it's a category of the understanding. So, to Alex's point, I think, see, what is it that I have all these little Eric quotes in my head. One of them is Kant epistemologizes ontology, and Hegel ontologizes epistemology, something like that. Is that right? I didn't.
Yeah.
But anyway, so yeah, I mean, yeah, ontology is whatever it is for Kant. It's not what it was, for the scholastics and so on.
I just wanted to just see if I'm, just to kind of clarify something or to see if I'm just totally off base. But I was talking to Tori about this recently, and it was like that. I think he does like. Yeah, I broadly agree. Like he's not, with the him epistemologizing ontology. Sorry. I agree with that. But I do think that he does say things that have some what I think anybody would call metaphysical import, like that there's something, for example, like that there's a something, that's outside of me. Which he literally says, and I think in this reading, is like it's the scandalousness of like the confusion in so many points of philosophy, or the incapacity in some to claim confidently that there is anything at all outside of myself. But so basically, just that, yeah, he's definitely, shifting the conversation towards epistemology, absolutely. But I think that he's doing so because he thinks that not well, maybe not because, but part of that is that he thinks that metaphysics, if there is to be one at all, it has to be really rigorous, absolutely certain, super careful stuff. Yeah. Super, really, really carefully constructed. And so that would mean that what can be said within that realm is going to be really limited. It's sort of like just dipping the toes barely. But well, there's something. There's us that. Hey, that's something. That's a real insight. Is that now we're solid on that, forevermore. At least for him, you know what I mean? So it's maybe thin gruel to somebody who's used to like porphyry or something, or like a whatever Neoplatonism or something, where there's a really robust, big, abstract machinery. But it's there. There are certain things to be garnered. There are certain things to be picked up, and certain people take that and run. I mean, gosh, we saw that in Schopenhauer in a sense. Like you can really certain people who believe themselves to be strict acolytes of Kant down to the letter have come to some pretty cool, I would say pretty cool, pretty interesting metaphysical conclusions. There's got to be, and that's not entirely a result of delusion. You know what I'm saying? There's something going on.
What's the basis of that? I mean, if someone used the metaphor of a cup, if we can't know the thing in itself, if we are within our own understanding because of the limits of our senses and experiences, then it's really, isn't it just an assertion? And what's going to determine the outcome is power, control.
Wait, would you say that again? I was watching the cat.
No, I was trying to be very serious about Hunter's comment about people taking Kant and coming to, I don't know if the word conclusion is correct, and I was saying, but on what basis? If the metaphor of the cup, if the idea of we only, if our understanding of the world is based on our experience and our sense perceptions, that we don't know the things in and of themselves, then if those understandings are going to be translated into polities, societies, cultures, then it boils down to power, as to what is going to be accepted.
So I'm channeling a book, which some of you guys will remember. I can't remember the author, but
Beiser.
What's that?
Beiser,
yeah. And he wrote a book on German idealism, and he made the point that German idealism was actually the effort to find a ground for objectivity. it's mischaracterized sometimes as, at least he said, and I found him convincing, that German idealism, because it starts with subjectivity, just makes everything subjective. But he makes the claim, I think convincingly, that what the effort is, at least starting with Kant, is given that we start with subjectivity, how is objectivity possible? And so part of the move, I mean, we're gonna get that in the book, that he thinks he can show that that from starting within, he can do this transcendental deduction and show that every rational consciousness structures the world in exactly the same way. That there's fundamental a priori structures that are common to the way every rational mind structures the world. And so that gives him a way to find some hard universal claims about empirical reality. And then when he gets to the critique of practical reason, he tries to do something similar in the domain of morality. So even though we're starting with subjectivity, I like that Beiser's characterization. The question is, how then do you get real hard objectivity, beginning with subjective consciousness? And Kant thinks he's done it. And I think largely, I mean, I sort of swallowed that pill. I think that's German idealism is largely trying to do that.
I would agree with that, totally. I think you especially see it in Hegel, who just outright argues that there's nothing outside of subjectivity, essentially, and that I'm not even gonna get into Hegel. But with Kant, I think it's important, and it's relatively early on when we get into space and time, which I think lays the groundwork for everything else in terms of the way his system operates. But he'll say that I believe the words are that time and space are objective in that they are transcendentally ideal and empirically real. And what he means by that is that he doesn't mean that time and space are definitely mind independently true, or even that for a different sort of species that they exist. Like Kant is saying, for the sort of cognition it is that we're calling a rational mind, these are absolutely necessary. There's not a single example or way of doing this without those in place, nor can it even be conceived of, which is some evidence of their necessity, to our way of thinking, right? Not to them being out there, but to our way of thinking. If we literally can't think outside of it, that's some sort of useful demonstration. And so they're transcendentally ideal because they shape everything, categorize everything, allow everything. They give everything the stage from which to appear, essentially. But they're empirically real, because what could be more real, even to a subjective creature, right? What could be more real than the thing which is universally necessary for your kind of cognition that you cannot possibly conceive of anything without? How real does real have to be, right? Even if it were real out there, that doesn't trump anything that word's been ruined. That doesn't.
But how do you know it's universal?
Well, that's what a big part of the project of this book is, to prove that, deduct.
Okay.
Yeah. And he only means universal for our kind of, for human rationality, because to say otherwise is, again, outside of bounds of all possible experience, at least for the experience that he's concerned with. So we don't know if other minds would require these. We just know that for seemingly the entire history of human civilization, we've never been able to think outside of this framework ever. And it structures every single thing that we do. And, time being the inner sense, the place where things appear, and space being the external, it's a bit like saying, try to think of something that doesn't have a location, space, or time. And it's almost more difficult than trying to conceive of just nothing. It's because you kind of want a container to put it in, it's really, arguably impossible. And the second that you try to reference an extended or existing thing in any sort of way, it always has a space and a time. It always has a here, um, or a there, right? A
But that,
location.
so we all agree because of the chemical physical processes of our carbon-based life form brains.
No, I don't, because Kant does not tie the conditions for possible knowledge to biology. In fact, the brain, this is one thing, students want to do this all the time. And the brain is part of empirical reality. As I say to students, I don't recommend it, but you could cut a hole in your skull and stick your hand in your brain and squish it. The brain is part of the empirical phenomenal world. It does not, transcendental, as Alex was saying, are the conditions for the possibility of. Well, the transcendental conditions for the possibility of empirical experience necessarily means the brain is not transcendental, because the brain is part of the empirical conditions, or part of empirical reality. So, and again, we're going to get into this in the book. He's going to go into this in a lot of depth, but he does a deduction. The way I think of it is it's a deduction backward, as it were. So given we have an empirical experience of this sort, if you kind of walk backwards and ask what must be necessary already, a priori, even for me to have an experience like this, what are those conditions? And one of them is, like Alex was saying, well, space and time, because can you have any kind of experience that is not conditioned, any kind of physical experience that is not conditioned by space? Can you have any interior experience that is not conditioned by time? So space and time are conditions for the possibility of having this kind of experience. And the brain is not, again, the brain is it's within space and time. It is the part of the conditioned. It is not that which conditions. And so I know it's a very weird way of, this is why I think Kant is so difficult to grasp the first time, is because he is not grounding the transcendental conditions for the possibility of experience. He is not grounding them biologically. But they are, like he's claiming, if you follow this deduction, you will discover that there are these conditions that have to already be in place for you to even have experience, much less make sense of it. There's conditions that must be already a priori. Prior to any kind of experience, there must be conditions that are already in place simply for me to even have an experience of the world. And those are the conditions he's the structuring principles, as I call them, the structuring principles of experience that he's going to claim he can deductively prove. So he's going to do a real deduction, the kind of, analogous to the kind of deduction you do in logic or geometry or any of the mathematics, those deductive arguments where you can deductively prove. He's going to try to do a deduction, as I think of it, that kind of walks backward from experience into the conditions that have to be in place for experience to occur.
So that deduction, it comes from Holy Roman law for the deduction of the rights of property. So it was about the kind of the succession of property rights in between people. That's where he gets this deduction from. So I'm not exactly sure how that relates to kind of the logical deduction, but I think he directly references some kind of like Holy Roman law thing about propriety and property and all that good stuff. So that's where it comes from, which is quite interesting. least I think so. Um, but yeah, okay, so one thing that um I'm following what y'all are saying as best as I can. My computer ran out of battery, but um so that space and time, those are conditions for experience. So having some kind of a sensible experience, those have to appear as an appearance in this form of space and time. But then we can think of things that do not correspond to this. That only applies to experience, sensible experience. Is that kind of the also that's this distinction in what's set up between, cognition, which needs to be limited to possible experience, and then thinking, which can, through ideas of reason can then grasp, man, grasp isn't the right word, but can at least think the noumenal, even if there's no corresponding experience with it. Is that kind of the same thing that's going on? I mean, okay, so one thing I think is, I think there's so much focus on with Kant on kind of this one, basically the first half of this book, the Critique of Pure Reason, that's kind of, I think, okay, what Hunter was saying that Nick Land said, which unfortunately I've seen that stupid interview, but basically I think Nick Land is wrong here. He's, okay, Kant isn't saying that there's like, oh, it's a complete black box. We have no idea what's going on outside. I think he's got ideas of reason about what's going on outside. There's space, time, there's these conditions of experience. You got your theater, but he's also very much interested in kind of what reason can do in the super sensible. And yeah, that's mainly not necessarily in this book, somewhat in the second half, but I don't know. It seems like that's a important point to make, I think, over his overall kind of like critical project is has this kind of element where he's not just kind of only limiting us to um experience. That's just for speculative cognition. And I think one thing also is, so when he talks about the I can't remember the exact, let's see if I can, oh, it's right here. Okay, the remarkable predisposition of our nature, noticeable to every human being, never to be capable of being satisfied by what is temporal, since the temporal is always insufficient for the predispositions of our whole vocation. So he in terms of temporality or the temporal, he's saying that that's insufficient, and every human being has a predisposition by nature to understand this. So I think that shows that there's something else going on here than just space and time as conditions of experience. That is probably the main thing probably in this book. I think in terms of his overall system that he's got layers, he's got depth, and that depth includes also this somewhere where uh temporality is insufficient for our whole vocation. Whatever vocation means, I'm not sure exactly, but yeah, rant over. But my main point is Nick Land is an idiot, really. Except his essay, Kant, Capital, and the Prohibition of Incest is actually pretty good. And actually probably really the only one that's relevant to Kant himself, I would say. Except, well, he has some other writings about Kant's aesthetics, but I think he was already losing his mind by then. which is kind of like it's okay, you know.
Thanks for keeping your closet door closed.
De nada.
Nevitt, when you're talking about there's apparently there was some book that everybody was into called Fanged Noumena. I don't know. But I've seen him on YouTube. But besides that, it's not. Also, really good lecture actually about some of his work, or that references some of his work that Chase you found on SoundCloud. Was Mark Fisher. You sent it to me. You sent me a link of a Mark Fisher lecture on SoundCloud where he like talks about why he disagrees with Nick Land. So I just want to, in case anybody hit Chase up for that sweet uh resource if you're interested. Not me though. I'm lazy. I don't know where to find that sort of stuff. He's all
Yeah, I'll try to find it again and post it on Discord.
I'm not trying to terminate the conversation, but because I'm afraid I'll forget. I think I put this in the email announcement. The reading for next time is really long. It's like 25, well, long for Kant. It's like 25 pages long. So just be warned. The reason is because the way the two translations uh, lay that information out in the books, there's no way to tease them apart. So like I think the Pluhar interleaves A and B and the other one puts them in successive things or something. I don't know. But anyway, I couldn't figure out a way to disentangle those two. So just um, whatever your time budget is for Kant, uh, you might want to double it for next week. Sorry about that.
I already read it and it was
Of course you did.
spellbinding.
Of course. I was gonna.
It's worth noting that if anybody stumbles onto like a word or anything that they want looked up, I do have this like Kant dictionary. Um, like I'm like really bad about using Discord. It's like watching someone 10 days from passing away to like try to figure out like brand new technology or something. It's pretty sad. But just like ask in there, send me a message or whatever, and I can like take photos of the things and send them to you. Since some of the stuff in there is like exceedingly helpful, since I think that personally, especially my first read through, um, like to get through Kant, you kind of need like some alcoholic beverage in this hand, a book holder in the center, and then a dictionary in the other hand. And that's sort of like the easiest way to get through it.
I
I
have,
ran out of PBR.
God no. I mean, Hunter has been drinking IPAs and some dark beers and some decent beer. Yeah, he's so Chase, you're gonna be
The corrupt influence of law school. I'm calling it right now. We're finally seeing it. The Hunter I used to know.
I'm such a fucking sellout. It's ridiculous, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we have a beer intervention, maybe Hunter will no longer have to be included. We'll just have to have an intervention on Chase to
Uh,
get him.
but yeah, that Kant dictionary. So I put a a folder that's a list of files in the Discord. I don't know if maybe I should put a pin on that because there's a lot going on in that Discord. But I have a PDF of that Kant dictionary in there, which is
Thank you for that.
from the little bit yeah, no problem. The little bit I've read of it too, I thought it was very helpful. And those dictionaries in general are quite helpful. Um, I'm kind of curious what other people, if any other people are reading some secondary, secondary, what the hell? Secondary text.
I
This is
would
what
be
happens if I
super
don't have my
careful.
PBR. I can't even talk right. I don't.
I would personally be super careful with secondary texts with Kant. Same thing happens with like Heidegger and Hegel and everybody. Um, like one issue that I run into, and this could be like limited, but I read Kant, most of the Critique of Pure Reason in undergrad, contrasting to Schelling, Hegel, and Fichte. And that was like my late modern course, following my modern course. And because I had read Kant directly, I was like, okay, there's a lot of things that challenge me here I haven't thought about before, etc. And then I would go on to have conversations with other people who predominantly were reading secondary literature, and we were just very often not having even remotely the same conversation. Like my experience with secondary Kantian literature is that it's like everyone has a wildly different version of Kant that they're trying to sell. And it seems easier most of the time to just read Kant than it is to try to figure out, I don't want to say like what their bias is, but it just seems more hermeneutically difficult to consult secondary sources other than the dictionaries. That's why I like the dictionaries, is because what they tend to do is they just point out everywhere that Kant uses a term, gives you the page numbers, you can go there, see it, and then yeah. But so do what you will. But in my experience, secondary literature, especially with Kant and Hegel, and even in Heidegger, can lead you astray really quickly. I was just witnessing today. I won't name the two extremely well-known Heidegger scholars, but they were having quite the spat on Facebook over how much of a Nazi Heidegger was or was not. So, and you begin seeing these like radical departures in translation as people want to highlight what they think is most important from a thinker. And I think just reading Kant and figuring that out for yourself is like top tier stuff, personally.
I had
Heidegger
that
was an
same.
angel and a Nazi.
I have the same dictionary. The only, my only, or I have also found it very, very useful. A little bit of caution. I was looking for a simple definition of intuition, because my guess is, unless you've been reading some of this stuff, the word intuition, what a person coming into who had never heard of any of this stuff, what they might think of the word intuition is not what Kant means by intuition. And so I thought, well, it'd be nice to have like a just short definition on intuition. But then when you look at, if you look at the intuition in this thing, it's like a multi-page history of the term, starting with Aristotle. And I think, like Alex could probably find within that, a few sentences that would give you what you need to know to distinguish Kant's notion of intuition from the everyday, you know, meaning. But just be aware, because the dictionary is very thorough. Sometimes he gives a whole lot of information, and it's kind of, I mean, I'm not trying to discourage people, because I have found it to be quite a good resource for myself, but it can be, occasionally can be intimidating.
I totally agree. One strategy that I started using um, when with these kinds of dictionaries, like whether it's the Heidegger lexicon or Hegel dictionary or whatever, is I have found what works for me. Again, take this with a grain of salt. I think there is something like beautiful about tarrying with a text, because like I would urge you to like read it before you ever pick up the dictionary, and then like finish where you're at or a few pages and revisit it, because very often what follows ends up kind of explicating what that meant to begin with. Like the context clues are just really delayed. Um, but then go to the text, and what'll happen is that a part of that whole genealogy of the term that often feels really unnecessary, and I'm not sure how helpful that is at times. Um, it should point to you where Kant uses these, at least in the text that you're like referencing, and then you can go to those spots and just read like a few sentences or paragraph around it and see how he's using it to get like added context clues. That tends to, at least for me, help me. But I also think that like just sitting with those things and kind of letting them wash over you and feeling unsure about them is honestly probably a better sign than not. I would actually say that like it's you should be cautioned if you like read through it and then you're like I immediately understand this, um, because probably most people are confused about it, but you could be super gifted.
I will be honest, a number of the texts that we have read in this group, we read cover to cover, and a number of them I still don't have a very firm grasp of what the hell's going on. So,
Nope. Hard same.
okay, any final words of wisdom,
Oh,
comments?
I was going to make one point just playfully. In defense of Kant and not in defense of the police, Mario, the comment on Discord. Just so we're clear, right? The main task of the police is only to put a stop to the violence on whose account citizens must fear each other in order that everyone may carry on his business calmly and safely. That's the concept of the police that he's holding up. If the police live to that concept, I don't think any of us have a real problem with it. It's precisely because the police depart from that concept that we have a problem with the police. So again, there are issues to criticize Kant on, and there is a lot of legalism in Kant, but I think his concept of the police here is one that we ought to actually get behind. His concept, not the actuality of class agents of class war that we see on the streets.
So when I read that the comment about the police, I was thinking that Kant is confusing a theoretical determination of the police with their practical use, which are very different. So it's kind of like, okay, he's saying the problem is basically that this would be to say that, oh, the police, have this as their chief business, therefore they're doing that, which I think is, I'll go on a limb and say that I think that's probably not the case. So I'm not sure where Kant would land on that exactly. I think he probably thought the police are mostly probably doing their chief business, but yeah, I don't know. I agree. Fuck the police. I agree with that.
Well, for Kant to write that, I know he never lived in Chicago.
He also was not black.
Are we in danger? Is this
Both
being
both
recorded?
true.
We're going to be flagged by AI.
Oh, I should probably the time where I should stop recording.